Welcome to the Victoria Memorial Hall on this, the 23rd of August 2019. This particular date is also controversial, debated. It's often believed that, at the stroke of midnight on this particular date, the city of Kolkata started its tryst with destiny, long time back. But that is also being debated by a lot of people. But be as it may, it happens to be a coincidence that we are doing this lecture this evening by Professor Sukanta Chaudhuri, Professor Emeritus, Jadavpur University, and the Founder Director, School of Cultural Texts and Records, Jadavpur University, on a subject which he has chosen to call Where is Kolkata? And of course, he will perhaps throw more light on why he chose to call it Where is Kolkata? It also happens to be a coincidence that today is Janmashtami. So at the stroke of midnight, some other things are going to happen as well, right? On such a day, we are glad that so many of you are here because the competition is stiff this evening. Because simultaneously, probably half the Department of English of Jadavpur University and St. Xavier's College will be heading towards the Birla Academy of Art and Culture for remembering Professor Pilal, because there's a very special event over there organized and conducted by Professor Anandulal this evening. So this is a coincidental clash, but then such things cannot be helped in a city like Kolkata, and that is probably what Professor Sukanta Chaudhuri is going to say, that there will be peaceful coexistence of so many Kolkatas at the same time. And there is also yet another competition that S.M. Krishna is going to belt out his thought-provoking, or shall we say only provoking, compositions in Kalamandir also this evening. So perhaps some people have headed for that also. I would like to request... No, in the evening he has a Kalamandir program. It's a public program, it's a ticketed program. Yeah? That's Sunday? Oh, is it? Oh, today is Jadavpur University. Ah, okay. So you see, in spite of all that, we know that Professor Sukanta Chaudhuri has his fan following here, and thank you very much for being here. So I would like to request Dr. Joyanta Sengupta to kindly introduce the speaker for this evening and welcome all of you.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's lecture, Where is Kolkata? By Professor Sukanta Chaudhuri, Emeritus Professor of English at Jadavpur University. I mean, it's always an honor to have him in the audience on a regular basis for our events, and it's a huge honor to have him as a speaker this evening. And frankly, I don't have a clue how one can even begin to introduce Professor Sukanta Chaudhuri to this audience. It is my own personal misfortune not to have been taught by him in Presidency College, where I had elective English, but he was away in Oxford. I will only say that he is one of those rare persons who, in these times of foreboding and increasing despondency, keep somebody like me and maybe many of you anchored by just being the kind of person that he is. So I'll just briefly say a few things about him. For those who don't know, he is, of course, a towering scholar and public intellectual whose work covers the entire range from the English and European Renaissance to translation, textual studies, and digital humanities. Educated at Presidency College, Kolkata, and the University of Oxford, Professor Chaudhuri has taught at Presidency College through the 1970s and 80s, and at Jadavpur University through the 1990s and 2000s, and has held visiting appointments at many places, including All Souls College, Oxford, St. John's College, Cambridge, the School of Advanced Study, London, the University of Virginia, and Loyola University in Chicago. At Jadavpur University, he was founding director of the School of Cultural Texts and Records, which is a pioneering center of digital humanities in India. and which to this day continues to assist us with the digitization of our many, many paper objects, including watercolors, photographs, and prints. As the director of the School of Cultural Texts and Records, he was a chief coordinator of Bichitra, the award-winning online varioram of the works of Rabindranath Tagore. Professor Chaudhuri's many publications, there are many, I will just briefly mention a few of them. Many publications include Infirm Glory, Shakespeare and the Renaissance Image of Man, which was published from Oxford in 1981. The Renaissance Pastoral and its English Developments, published from Oxford in 1989. And the Metaphysics of Text, published from Cambridge in 2010. He has edited the 2-volume Pastoral Poetry of the English Renaissance, published from Manchester in 2016, besides other early modern texts and collections of essays, including the 2-volume Calcutta Living City, which was published in 1990 by Oxford University Press. He is an honorary fellow of the Asiatic Society, Kolkata, and a member of the Executive Committee of the International Shakespeare Association. In 2017, on the occasion of the bicentenary of Presidency University, he was conferred the Distinguished Alumnus Award of that institution. Professor Sukanta Chaudhuri is one of our most distinguished translators who have translated, among many, many other things, Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks from Italian to Bengali, Edward Lear's complete limericks from English to Bengali, and seemingly untranslatable Bengali books like Shokumar Rai's Abul Tabul and Annoda Shankar Rai's Ha Ha Ho Ho into mesmerizing English. And I would refrain at this point from commenting on his stature as a rising playwright, which began in 2007 with Jaha Chai. But I could go on and on. I would stop here. Like all of you, I am looking forward very eagerly to knowing where exactly Kolkata is and where it is headed next. So that's all I have to say. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Sukanta Chaudhuri to speak on where is Kolkata. Shukanta.
Thank you very much. Jayantaka, if you could kindly also do the honors of handing over the memento on behalf of Victoria Memorial Hall to Professor Chaudhuri. Ladies and gentlemen, how many of you have a ringtone that has Kolkata? If you have a ringtone which has anything to do directly with Kolkata or with some Krishna bhajan, then those are allowed to ring. All the other mobile phones should be switched off, please. Yeah, or put on silent, at least for the duration of this lecture. So, Professor Sukanta Chaudhuri.
Yes, that sounds threatening enough. Anyway, thank you very much, Jayanto, for the honor of this invitation, and you, Raju. And thank you for, well, I don't know how much I should thank you for that embarrassingly kind introduction. But anyway, let's move on to other things. But I think, before I begin what I have to say, I would like just very briefly in a sentence or two to pay my tribute and render my thanks to two persons, neither of whom is with us any longer, who, in fact, taught me much of what I know about the city and motivated me to find out much more. Professor Monideep Chatterjee and Dr. Dhrubajyoti Ghosh. Professor Chatterjee was an architect and town planner. Dr. Ghosh was a civil engineer and an environmentalist. What I'm going to talk about today, well, it doesn't contain very much that is directly derived from what I learned from them. But in a wider sense, I feel kind of their inspiration behind anything that I write or speak or even think that has to do with the city. So I would like to offer this lecture to their memory. And, well, I deliberately put my title in the form of a question just to make it obvious that I'm not going to answer any of your expectations about telling you where it is. I mean, well, that's, I suppose, what I've done all my life, what most teachers do all their lives, which is to, confuse their students still more by trying to teach them that there are no answers. There are only questions which lead to more questions. And I would like to just raise some of those questions today. I take my title from a poem by Sukumar Rai that I think all of you will be familiar with, at least all of you who read Bengali, Kolkata Kothare. this man who lives in Giridih, he gets an invitation to a party that he wants to attend in Kolkata, but he doesn't know where Kolkata is, and nobody there can tell him. So he finally looks at the railway timetable and goes down the list of stations, and then he reaches the end where it says either Howrah or Shalda, but there's no Kolkata. So poor man, to the end, he never finds out where Kolkata is, and he misses the treat. This, of course, nearly 100 years before today's station, which is actually called Kolkata, that didn't exist at its time. But actually, this point is made on a more serious plane by the late Rabindra Kumar Dasgupta in an article that he contributed among so many other distinguished writers who did me the honor for that book that Jayanta mentioned, Calcutta, the Living City, brought out in the year of the tercentenary. Professor Dasgupta was writing on Calcutta, as it was then be called, in Old Bengali literature. And I quote from his article, "Where is Kolkata in 18th century Bengali literature? The strange but true answer to this question is practically nowhere. Not that Bengal lacked an urban experience. There were major cities in the region through history, Tamralipto and Karnashubarna, then the Sonargaon Dhaka circuit, the Pandua Goud circuit, Chattogram, Saptagram. By the 16th century, urban development had fired the Bengali imagination enough to generate the striking account of the building of Kalketu city in Mukundaram Chakraborty's Chondimongol. Chondimongol also mentions Kolikata, along with Kalighat and other place names, Chitpur, on this side of the river, and Shalkia, and Betor on the other side. But of course, this Kolikata in the Chondimongol is the old village, not the British-founded city, which was far in the future. But long after Job Charnock's arrival, in the middle third of the 18th century, Bharat Chandra, in his Annada Mongol, celebrates not only the court of his patron Maharaja Krishna Chandra at Nodia, which will later come to be called Krishnanagar after Krishna Chandra, but also the city of Bardhaman. But there is no celebration, virtually no mention of Kolkata in the Bengali literature of the time. The literary and cultural centers of Bengal in the 18th century were elsewhere, in the courts of Nodia, Bardhaman, Dhaka, Bishnupur, in centers of learning like Navadvip and Shantipur, and of course Murshidabad, the seat of the Nawabs of Bengal. When Kolkata does make its debut in Bengali literature, it is predominantly in a vein of satire, not celebration. In fact, the first poetic praise of Kolkata I know is neither in Bengali nor in English, but in Urdu. It's an encomium of the city by Ghalib, who spent a couple of frustrating years here chasing a pension which he never received. But still, he seemed to bear the city no grudge because, as I said, he wrote a very eloquent praise of the city at the time of his departure. But in Bengali, even before, Ghalib was here over 1828, 1829, but already from a few years earlier, comic sketches of upstart Kolkata society had begun appearing since 1821 in the journals Sangbad Kaumudi and Samachar Darpan. They were probably the work of Bhavani Charan Bandyopadhyay, who in 1823 brought out Kolikata Kamalalaya, a satiric dialogue between the newcomer to the city and a resident. And then Bhavani Charan also brought out Nobo Babu Bilash in 1825. After quite an interval came Parichad Mitro's Alaled Gored Dulal, 1858, and Kaliprashanna Singho's Hutum Pachan Noksha, 1862. And over the span of time, Ishat Chandra Gupta wrote a quantity of verse satire of Kolkata society, including a good deal which is directed at the British. But till the end of the century, there is no comparable body of literature presenting Kolkata in a positive, let alone an attractive or a romantic light. And yet, over this period precisely, the city had become the undisputed economic and cultural center of Bengal. It was a humming place. So what can account for its effective and affective absence from the cultural records of the time, which were to such a great extent being produced within the city itself? The first factor is well known, but it's a good point to start. It's an easy point to make pictorially. Old Kolkata was sharply divided. Yeah, thank you. Old Kolkata was sharply divided into the white quarters, as you've seen. I mean, this painting is actually here in the Victoria, and the black quarters, the white town and the black town. Okay. Let us look at two slightly later photographic views. This is Old Courthouse Street in the 1920s. And actually, I'm not sure which street this is. I don't know whether any of you can identify it for me. But clearly, it's a very different ambience from the previous one. But really to know what the problem was, let's look at a couple of more slides. You see, now, even if we were to go back to many of the quarters of the old white town, which have many deplore come down in the world, or of the quarters of the old black town, which, although we're not always ready to admit it, have often improved substantially, you can't tell the difference so readily. It all seems to have blurred out. The actual difference arises if you look at it from above, or if you really sort of dig down deep enough. See, in fact, if you open YouTube now, you'll find a number of these aerial videos of Kolkata. These are stills from one of them. This is taken from a drone, which over here is just progressing from the Maidan on the left. Clearly, that is Chowrangi, that straight road separating the Maidan from the built-up area to the right, to the east. And just look at the layout of the streets. It's not exactly regular or geometrical. It never is in Kolkata. That, in fact, is a point which has made the development of Kolkata very difficult. If you look at the old report by E.P. Richards, the CIT report, the Calcutta Improvement Trust report, before that organization actually began improving Calcutta, then Richards has a lot to say about the absence of any clear grid to the roads in Calcutta, especially as then constituted, and to a great extent still now. But okay, this is still part of the white town. Okay. Move on. This place, this is just north of Esperade. So just below the border of this this particular slide are Victoria House and Statesman House, and that road taking off at an angle. Oh, there's a. Oh, okay, thanks. Which is this one? Is it the one? Look, I think it's simpler if I just go. This is Bentinck Street. That is Central Avenue. Taking off at a tangent. This is Victoria House. Crosses it. And a little while later, in the next slide I'll show you, Central Avenue has turned northwards again. But just the point is, look at the layout of the streets, and you can see how, to the what is the north, the top left of the picture, which is towards the north, the buildings are so much more in a cluster. And here, we move further up to the north. See? You see the difference? Now, so the real difference is in the layout and therefore underground. If you want to bring these parts of the city to this basic state of urban planning and layout that we saw in the first one, in this one, you would have to knock down all the buildings, dig deep down, relay all the roads and drains and utilities before you could get something like this. See, the difference is absolutely ingrained in the very fabric of the city. It's not just a matter of visual impressions and pavement stalls or nice shop fronts or that kind of thing. Okay. So this glaring disparity, it cannot be, and in fact, despite very considerable improvement brought about over the last half century by the Calcutta Improvement Trust, for which we don't always give it credit, this disparity cannot be rectified entirely. See? And this, in turn, compromised, from the 19th century, the residents' entitlement to civic amenities, quality of life, and political status, even for the comprador Rajas in their North Kolkata palaces. In 1917, Rabindranath looks out from the balcony of his Jorashako mansion, and writes in Kortarichai Kormo, I'm translating, the moment a monsoon breeze blows, our lane gets flooded right up to the main road. The wayfarer's shoes must be carried over his head like an umbrella, and it becomes clear that the inhabitants rank no higher in the struggle for existence than amphibious beasts. I saw the flood of waters contending with the flood of humans on Chitpur Road, and at last began to ponder deeply, why do we put up with it? That we need not put up with it, and that it is better not to do so, becomes obvious if we once set foot in Chorungi. It is part of the same city, under the same municipality. The only difference is that we put up with it, and they do not. Underlying the literature of Kolkata over 3 centuries is a subliminal tale of 2 cities. One a center of power, activity, and high finance, but with no umbilical link to the other Kolkata that provided a social and cultural space for the Bengali psyche, that even had some grand buildings, but was a disaster in terms of planning and municipal services. And there, I mean, if you actually look at the situation, I mean, literally on the ground, or if you look at the statistics, and you look at the facts, I mean, I know that this runs contrary to all our nostalgic sentiment, but the situation of Kolkata, old North Kolkata, has immeasurably improved over the last 50 years, since the foundation of the CMDA, or the KMDA as it now is. But in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, the 2 sectors confronted each other like self-reflections in a distorting mirror, each unviable, indeed unthinkable without the other, locked in a distrustful symbiosis, deconstructing each other, one may say. Now, we may also say quite reasonably that this is nothing special. All colonial cities show the same binarity between the quarters inhabited by the rulers and by the ruled. But I will argue that owing to certain crucial factors in its history, then and later, Kolkata has acquired a special existential uncertainty that is now part of its being, a disconcerting inheritance. The geographical and architectural binarity symbolizes the second factor. The city attracted a stream of seekers after a livelihood, and in course of time, after education, chiefly in the interests of that livelihood. The obscure 18th century poet Kului Chandra Sen, I mean, don't be ashamed to confess you haven't heard of him, I hadn't either. He was a sort of court poet, if that is not too grand a term, of the Shobhabaja Rajbari in the 18th century. Well, this Kului Chandra has a succinct couplet. Ratarati borolok hoibar tore, ghor chhede Kolikata gya bash kore. But the operative phrase is ghor chhede. For these people, their roots remained in the villages, as commonly did their families, social loyalties, and property, if any. That would always be their desh. Kolkata was where they obtained their living, and for some, their most rewarding intellectual gains. Yet they did not inhabit the city emotionally. It enshrined a different order that they addressed for survival or profit. Their engagement with the city was gradual, often labored, and never complete. This alienation could sometimes be an advantage. In Bhavani Charan's Kolikata Kamalaloy, the resident explains to the visitor that people could seek their fortunes in Kolkata more freely, even by wrongdoing, because no one knew them there. They need not fear the censure of their community. আমার এখানে জ্ঞাতি কুটুম্ব কেহ নাই, আমি নিন্দিত বা অনিন্দিত কর্ম করিলে আমাকে কেহ কিছুই কহিবেক না. Family migration was very much the exception rather than the rule. Through the second half of the 19th century, the gender ratio of the population was roughly 2 males to 1 female, and in fact it was the female population was sliding slowly through the second half of the 19th century, finally in 1911 dipping to 2 females for 5 males, a worse proportion. And if you look at the female labor force, there the dip is even sharper. The population of Kolkata did not treat the place as their home, even if they worked there, earned there, studied there, and even lived there most of the time. The paradox grew sharper as Kolkata became a vibrant intellectual center, a seat of the arts, and a seedbed of social and political debates and campaigns. Directly or indirectly, this activity stemmed largely from the institutions of the Raj, which were never totally integrated with the indigenous psyche. Perhaps the classic instance is the case of Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar. In both education and social reform, he worked the state machinery to implement parts of a grand design born of a genius peculiarly his own, in uneasy engagement with Sahibs and Indians alike, ending in disheartened withdrawal, not even back to his native Medinipur, but to the tribals of Karmatar. Vidyasagar's trajectory might be thought idiosyncratic, reflecting his exceptional, in fact, in that age, in some ways unique genius. But one may say that in a general way, not until 1906, when Ashutosh Mukherjee became the Vice Chancellor of Calcutta University, did Kolkata's intellectual life truly find a center of gravity within the city. The situation was different but the same for the new indigenous patrician class, the comprador rajas, as Pradeep Sinha terms them. Technically rent collectors, but effectively landowners in the countryside, realtors in the city, and sometimes patrons of scholarship, art, and letters. They hailed from various parts of Bengal and beyond. Their new loyalties were divided between town and country, but anchored in the latter, because the latter, the countryside, was in fact the basic source of wealth and the site of a free-ranging authority, which they could not exercise to anything like the same extent in the city. They were completely overtowered by the British. This was especially the case after the decline of native commercial enterprise in the 19th century, placing increasing reliance on the assured blessings of the permanent settlement, a shift exemplified in the passage from Dwarakanath Thakur's generation to Debendranath's. There would have been no Jorashako, let us not forget, without Shilaidaho and Potishar, Mirampur and Kaligram. That's where the money was coming from. Nor did the British make Kolkata their own, needless to say. They were not colonizers in the old Roman sense. They had no intention of settling in the city or indeed in the country. Over a vastly larger arena, they enacted the same paradigm as their subjects, treating the city as a profitable transit camp. In fact, much more drastically so, as they need have no qualms whatsoever about their extractive role. Kolkata, like the rest of India, was a place for them to appropriate and exploit, but one to which they would never belong. Thus, for all or most of Kolkata's colonial history, there was virtually no one with a proper stake in the city. No one who would say from the heart, "This is where I belong." Through most of the long 19th century, the city was the most happening place in Bengal, arguably in India and even beyond, very arguably in the British Empire outside Britain itself. But the city somehow doesn't seem to integrate itself with these activities taking place there. It does not stamp them with any particular genius of location. We can look at all the varied products of the powerhouse, all the things being produced there, all the things being done there, happening there, and still ask, where is Kolkata in all this? How does the city enter into all that's going on, geographically, formally in the city? The city's presence in the flourishing literature of the time is no less elusive, even among writers who lived there. Kolkata might activate, but it did not directly engage, the finest exercise of their imagination. The outstanding non-engagement is that of Bankim Chandra. Of course, you may say Bankim Chandra did not really belong to Kolkata. He came from Kathalpada, Noihati, which at that time would have been regarded as a completely separate geographical entity. Among his workplaces as a civil servant and magistrate, some were near Kolkata, Barashat, for instance, but at that time, Barashat also would not have counted as part of Kolkata. See? It was only during the last 3 years of his life, after retirement, that Bankim Chandra actually came to live in Kolkata. But his mental engagement with the state system and the economic system and the nascent political system emerging out of Kolkata was total. And yet, most of his novels are historical. Sometimes, as in Chandrasekhar or his last 3 works, Anandamot, Devi Chodhurani and Sitaram, the history is of fairly recent date, after the foundation of Kolkata, but the city features in them marginally, if at all. The site of Bankim's patriotic and communal imagination is either rural Bengal or various locations in Mughal India of still earlier date. His social novels like Bishbrikho, Rajani or Krishnakanted Will might feature Kolkata, but as a location, not as any kind of meaningful ambience, just as a formal location. The same is true of most of Rabindranath's fiction, both novels and short stories, though Rabindranath, of course, was born and bred in the city. Even when the story is set in Kolkata, it is merely a formal presence, as in Choturango, or as in Jogajog, presented in negative contrast to the country, as in so much of Tagore's other work in both prose and poetry. Classically, those oft-quoted lines from that early poem, Bodhu. Hayare Rajdhani Pashan Kaya, Iter por It, Maje Manush Kit, Naiko Bhalobasha, Naiko Maya. The first great visionary moment of Tagore's poetic life, enshrined in the poem Nirjhare Shapnabhango, came to him in the city as he looked out from the balcony of his brother's house on Shodder Street. But the scene that he describes features nothing but trees and the rising sun. The trees of the free school that was at that time still actually there on Free School Street, now Mirza Ghalib Street. Only in one novel, Gora, does Tagore weave the cityscape into the action and his character psychology. Translated the very opening sentences of the novel, actually. On a Shravan morning, the clouds have dispelled, filling the Kolkata sky with clear sunshine. There is no pause in the flow of carriages down the road. The peddlers are crying incessantly. Baskets of fish and vegetables have arrived to feed those about to set off for the office, college, or courtroom, and kitchens are filling with smoke. Yet in this great, hard-hearted workplace that is Kolkata city, the stream of golden sunlight seems to have set a youthful tide flowing through its hundreds of roads and lanes. There is nothing later in the novel that quite matches the symbiosis of urban humanity and the cityscape, but the urban scene is evoked from time to time and worked thematically and emotionally into the fiction. For instance, in a pivotal dialogue in chapter 15, Gora and Binoy, they can come to terms with their ideals only at night, when the noise of the city is stilled, when it is no longer so obtrusively a city. I quote in translation. On all sides, stretching to the horizon, the ranks of rooftops of all sizes, high and low, sometimes mingling with the crowns of trees, lay sprawled like a vast, unreal, utterly dispensable fantasy. In any case, the city being described in Gora is of a much earlier date than the time when Rabindranath was actually writing it. That was 1907 to 8, when the novel was being serialized. But Gora, remember, was an orphan waif born at the time of the uprising of 1857. Okay, so the city being described here would have been the city of, I suppose, the 1870s and or early 1880s. And this is what the novelist has to say about it. At that time, the Ganga at Kolkata and its banks had not been afflicted on land and water with the ugliness of a merchant culture greedy for profit. It had not put on its iron fetters of railway tracks on the bank and a bridge upon the river. At that time, in the winter evening, the blackened breath of the city did not blot out the sky so completely. In other words, the city seems to stimulate the novelist's imagination insofar as it is imperfectly a city. Beneath such conditional acceptance, the ideal being projected is that of the Bengal countryside. This appears in a different way in the celebrated late poem, Bashi, a poem of rare empathy with an impoverished clerk in a city slum, Kinugoalar Guli. His life sadly lit by recollections of the woman he did not marry. But he conjures her up in his mind as a married woman, Porone Dhakai Shari, Kopale Shidur, by the Dholeshwari river flowing past their village home, a domesticity not his, in a locale not his. He has missed out on the alternative life that might have endowed his existence with value. And so it seems, as the city where he has finally found himself. The design is repeated more extensively in Bibhutibhushan Bandopadaya's Operajito. The narrative core of Operajito alternates between vignettes of, on the one hand, Opu's village home and other rural settings, and on the other, the city that he camps and works in. I say camps because he never feels any bond with the place. Now, You know that still from Satyajit Ray's Aparajito, which is at this point, the film isn't always, but at this point, it's a very clear reflection, sort of pictorialization, as it were, of Vibhuti-Bhushan's account of Opu's first arrival in the city. The people Opu meets in Kolkata, the political and commercial activity he sees, above all the libraries he visits, open up the most precious resources of his mind. But the city where this happens remain alien to him. Virtually starving, in desperate search for work, he wanders distractedly through the commercial center and finds release only when his poetic mind rises above it. Let me cite a passage in translation. Far away, he's on the Maidan. Okay. Far away, the trams to Khidirpur are going past. There's the chimney of a large ship in the direction of the river. The radio mast atop the fort. 1, 2, 3, 4. How blue is the sky. What free-ranging beauty on all sides. The fierce silence of this quivering Shravan afternoon, the same month that Rabindranath was evoking in Gora, in a very different part of Kolkata. Lightning, the sun, the stars, love, mother, elder sister, all now dead. The boundless blue sky overhead, the land beyond death. So again, Kolkata is engaging the protagonist to the extent that it is not Kolkata, but has transcended its basic urban identity, to which it has transported itself somewhere else, some place the very opposite of itself. After Opu's marriage, he returns to the city, having left his bride with her parents, but in memory lays a fleeting romantic patina over the city. He buys flowers from a vendor in College Square. Quote in translation. With the scent of the flowers, he felt a clear, aching sensation within his mind, the pain of something gained and lost, a vacancy, an emptiness. It was as though he could smell the girl's hair. But when he finally brings his wife to Kolkata to a sordid, cheap tenement, he sees the ambience as destroying all romance. Here again, Satyajit Ray's pictorialized Vibhuti-Bhushan's description very clearly. Okay. The house was airless. One might catch a bit of breeze by sitting on the balcony, but there was the mouth of the drain close by, with the whole building's load of rotting vegetable peel, fish scales, rubbish, stale rice and curry. On a rainy day, the place hung with the building's dirty and half-dirty clothes hung out to dry, with here and there a battered tin trunk and there a coal basket. The children were grubby, clad in filthy frocks or pinafores. It is in fact very like the sordid lane in Rabindranath's Bashi. And Vibhuti-Bhushan quite possibly had that poem in mind. But you'll note that Opu there is literally holding a Bashi. Okay, it's the one kind of redeeming mental prop of his life, as earlier had been that globe which you see him catching, that little globe given to him by the headmaster of his village school, which is for him the symbol of urban learning and the bridge to a better world. Now, maybe because of some my sort of literary explorations in a completely different direction, I see this literature of Kolkata redeemed only by the potential to sometimes not be Kolkata, as what in technical literary criticism is called the pastoral negative. See? Pastoral literature is of course, it's a recognized formal genre in European literature, and it's a vein that you find in, I think, literatures across the world. It presents an idealized, often unreal countryside, typically populated by improbably refined, poetic-minded shepherds and shepherdesses, hence the term pastoral, as an imaginative contrast to the actual dispiriting urban life of the poet and his audience. In standard pastoral, it is the ideal or positive landscape that the poet depicts, leaving the reader to draw the contrast with the dispiriting urban world. Here it is the opposite. The anti-pastoral city is foregrounded, the idealized rural contrast glimpsed only in flashes. In still rarer visionary moments, does the city present itself in the light of rural nature? That's some of these passages I read out to you from Tagore and from Vibhuti-Bhushan. But which way does the semblance work? Has nature redeemed the city, or the city corrupted nature? To the end, Opu takes his soul's bearings from the land, the remoter the better. After his wife's death, he works in the remote countryside for years. On a visit to the city, he tells a friend, "That star you see there, I have seen it rise for years now over the thickly forested hilltop. Today, as it rises above the Whiteway Laidlaw building, it seems something new." The Whiteway Laidlaw building was, I trust I'm right in saying this, the building actually called Sachidananda Mansions, which many of us still think of as the cottage industries building, at the corner of Esplanade. Towards the end, having returned to his childhood village with his son, I quote, he felt sorry for the student in the city, as he had himself been in the past months. Their father lives in Bowajar, their uncle at Potuatola, their aunt at Bagbajar. They have never known Bengal. Have they ever seen the sky taking on colour above the hayfields of Madhupur village, or heard the doves cooing amidst thick foliage on a still autumn afternoon? They have never sat on the floor under a mud cottage porch and watched the moonlight tremble on coconut fronds. They are indeed very unfortunate. This is a fit passage to introduce the next chapter of my story. Opu, after all, had a village home to which he could return. After 1947, some 10 million Bengalis were permanently deprived of theirs. Following, or indeed anticipating, independence come partition, Bengal witnessed by far the biggest mass migration in human history. Following, let us not forget, a horrendous famine and a succession of riots over the previous decade and more. Between 1946 and 1970, a span of some 25 years, 4.2 million government-registered refugees alone crossed over from what was then East Pakistan into West Bengal. The best guess at the total figure of 8 million settled in West Bengal alone, not counting those who either went of their own accord or those who were resettled in other states like Odisha or Madhya Pradesh or the Andamans. But those who settled in West Bengal alone, the official figure, is about 8 million. Plus 2 million who moved in the opposite direction, from West Bengal to the east, to what was then Pakistan. These people, often impoverished to start with, now sank into utter destitution with a thin topping of frustrated bourgeoisie. Such an upheaval could not but transform the life of the city. First of all, it fashioned a radically new Kolkata in the literal geographical sense. The greater number of migrants settled over a vast refugee belt encircling Kolkata, but even in the inner city, what was then the area of the Calcutta Corporation, which was considerably smaller than what it is now. Even in the inner city, refugee migrants constituted 18% of the population in 1961. And in what we think of as Greater Calcutta, now, I don't know the figures, but very roughly one can imagine it might have been the reverse. 18% of the local earlier population, and roughly 18 to 20% of that, and maybe 80% of migrants. Maybe not as much as that, but a large proportion, certainly. The civic facilities of the city were stretched beyond breaking point, and in fact, in the new settlements around and beyond the inner city, there were no civic facilities at all. The economy of the city was devastated by the loss of much of its hinterland, most notoriously, of course, the fact that the jute fields remained in East Pakistan, whereas the jute mills were chiefly in West Bengal on the banks of the Hooghly. And the politics of Bengal entered an extreme phase of protest and disarray, culminating in the Naxalite movement of the 1960s and early 1970s. Yet, singularly, something else now begins to happen that had not happened when the city was the second city of the British Empire. This is the time when Kolkata begins to forge an identity of its own, not as with most cities at a time of growth and expansion, but when its fortunes were at their lowest ebb. I can think of two reasons for this, which may or may not be thought adequate. One, and this I think is the decisive reason, the pivotal reason. For the first time ever, Kolkata acquired a large resident population with no home but the city, nowhere else to belong. If they had another home elsewhere, they left it behind with no hope of return. They had to admit Kolkata to their hearts and minds if the psychic displacement was not to be as total as the physical. Of course, it would be a very different Kolkata to anything that existed earlier. The colonies of the refugee belt that from the virgin land of the 1950s have today pulled themselves up by their bootstraps to become bustling middle-class localities. The older middle-class localities that, after the first shock of partition, have reinvented themselves in phases in the last 70 years. Above all, the old white town, which by now is completely transmogrified. It was a distinctive version of the urban growth across India since independence, but a very distinctive one indeed in Kolkata, with a vastly smaller injection of funds, especially in the earlier decades. I mean, until the founding of the KMDA in 1971, there were practically no sort of state funds, no Government of India funds being injected into Kolkata at all. And also, of course, Kolkata had to deal uniquely, not just of the cities in India, but of any city anywhere in the world, of having to absorb this huge tidal wave of post-partition influx, disorder, and destitution. And that was the second factor at work. It's just this immeasurable demographic upheaval. Okay? So immense was the impact of the partition that it seems to have activated the beleaguered imagination of the citizens, old and new, to define their state as never before. Thus, at the nadir of its fortunes, Kolkata was validated as an imaginative entity. And it was a curiously selective validation. The output of partition classics in Bengali poetry and literature is surprisingly sparse, though there is in fact a great mass of material in old magazines, including a quantity of remarkable short stories that one hopes before long some scholars are going to dig up and some publishers are going to reprint. There's a rich treasure trove waiting there. But certainly of the canonical literature, some early modernist Bengali poets have left memorable images of Kolkata in their work. Perhaps most unexpectedly, and yet not if you think in terms of that pastoral paradigm of city versus country, Jibanananda Das, whose dominant strain we think of as rural and romantic, and yet who has left behind so many remarkable vignettes of the Kolkata of his time. This may be an extreme case of the pastoral binarity, as I said. But amazingly, this age of epic suffering and survival finds no adequate reflection. I don't say find no reflection, but no adequate reflection in the outstanding fiction of the time. The leading novelists resort to the countryside, or at most to small towns, Vibhuti Bhushan himself, or Tarashankar, or Shotinath Bhaduri. Atin Bandyopadhyay's partition classic Nilkantha Pakir Khoje is predominantly set in the pre-partition countryside of eastern Bengal. The one major exception is Manik Bandyopadhyay. Manik presents the destitution of a populace ravaged beyond their normal endemic poverty by war, famine, and finally partition. In story after story, like Atmahottar Adhikar, Ke Bachaye Ke Bache, or, though this is set in the countryside, the visceral analysis of the famine syndrome, Chiniye Khaini Kano. These stories disturb us above all by presenting subhuman deprivation, not as a one-off momentary crisis, but as a sustained, normal condition of being. This unendurable, yet endlessly endured continuance of suffering is made still more harrowing when presented visually in Mrinal Sen's film of Atmahottar Adhikar, one of the four short pieces gathered together in Kolkata Ekattor.